Welcome to History in Flames. Empires rise and fall, the past comes alive in fire and ash. Subscribe and relive stories that shaped the world. August 1st, 1944. 5 years of Nazi occupation. 5 years of terror, starvation, and murder. The Polish resistance, the Home Army, had been planning this moment for years. The Soviet army was approaching from the east. The time had come. At exactly 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944, known as W Hour, the Warsaw Uprising began. What followed was 63 days of the most brutal urban combat in the history of the Second World War. 200,000 Polish civilians dead, an entire city destroyed, and a Soviet army that watched from across the river and did nothing. To understand the Warsaw Uprising, you must first understand what 5 years of Nazi occupation meant. Warsaw was the capital of occupied Poland, and Poland was treated by the Nazis as a slave state. Polish universities were closed. Polish culture was systematically destroyed. Jews were confined to the Warsaw Ghetto and then murdered. By 1944, Warsaw had lost nearly a third of its pre-war population. The city was starving. The Polish people had had enough. The Polish Home Army was the largest resistance movement in occupied Europe. At its peak, it numbered 400,000 fighters. It operated underground hospitals, schools, courts, and even a postal service. It had been preparing for an uprising against the Nazi occupation for years, waiting for the right moment. By the summer of 1944, that moment seemed to have arrived. By the summer of 1944, the tide of the war had turned dramatically on the Eastern Front. Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet offensive, had destroyed the German Army Group Center. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly westward. By late July 1944, the Red Army had reached the Vistula River, the eastern boundary of Warsaw. The Polish Home Army could hear the Soviet guns from the city. Liberation seemed imminent. General Tadeusz Borka-Morawski, commander of the Home Army, faced an impossible decision. If the Poles rose up before the Soviets arrived, they risked being destroyed by the Germans. If they waited for the Soviets, the Communists would take control of Poland. Borka-Morawski decided to act. He believed the Soviets would support the uprising. He was wrong. At 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944, WR Warsaw rose. At exactly 5 p.m. on August 1st, 1944, WR 40,000 Polish fighters emerged from hiding across Warsaw. They attacked German positions with whatever weapons they had, which was not much. Pistols, a few machine guns, homemade grenades. Against a professional German garrison with tanks, artillery, and air support, in the first hours of the uprising, the Poles achieved remarkable successes, capturing key buildings and cutting German communication lines. In the first days of the uprising, the Polish Home Army captured large sections of Warsaw, the Old Town, parts of the city center, key bridges. For a brief moment, it seemed the uprising might succeed. The fighters, many of them teenagers, fought with extraordinary courage. Women fought alongside men. Children carried messages and ammunition. The entire city was mobilized. Warsaw was fighting for its life. Hitler's response was immediate and savage. He ordered Warsaw to be completely destroyed and its population killed or expelled. SS General Erich von Dym-Baka-Zalewski was put in command of the German forces tasked with crushing the uprising. He brought with him some of the most brutal units in the German military, including SS brigades that had been used for mass murder in the Soviet Union. What followed was systematic atrocity. On August 5th and 6th, 1944, German SS forces entered the Wola district of Warsaw and began systematically massacring the civilian population. Men, women, and children were shot in the streets, in hospitals and churches. Patients were dragged from their beds and killed. In 2 days, approximately 40,000 civilians were murdered in Wola alone. It was one of the largest single massacres of the entire Second World War, and it was just the beginning. As the Germans massacred the population of Warsaw, the Soviet army, which had been advancing rapidly toward the city, stopped. Stalin ordered his forces to halt on the eastern bank of the Vistula River. The official explanation was logistical. The advance had outrun its supply lines. But the real reason was political. Stalin did not want a free Polish government to control Warsaw when the Soviets eventually arrived. He was willing to let the Germans destroy the Polish resistance for him. The Polish government in exile in London begged the Western Allies for help.
Oh.
Churchill was deeply moved and wanted to act. Roosevelt was more cautious. He needed Soviet cooperation for the war against Japan. The RAF and the American Air Force flew supply missions to Warsaw, dropping weapons and ammunition by parachute from enormous distances. Stalin refused to allow Allied aircraft to land on Soviet airfields after the missions, making the supply drops far less effective. For a month, the Polish fighters held the old town of Warsaw against overwhelming German force. They fought street by street, building by building, room by room. They evacuated the wounded through the city's sewers, carrying them through kilometers of underground tunnels, while German forces tried to flush them out. On September 2, 1944, the old town fell. The survivors escaped through the sewers. The fighting continued in other parts of the city. Inside the areas controlled by the Home Army, life went on with extraordinary normality. Newspapers were published daily, schools operated, hospitals functioned under constant bombardment. Priests held mass in ruined churches. Cafes opened when they could. The Polish people were determined to maintain civilization in the middle of destruction. Artists painted, musicians played. This was not just a military uprising, it was a declaration of what it meant to be Polish. Some of the most extraordinary fighters of the Warsaw Uprising were children, the so-called little insurgents. Boys and girls as young as 10 carried messages, ammunition, and supplies through the city under fire. Some became scouts who mapped German positions. Some fought with weapons. The most famous was a boy known as Antek, 13 years old, who carried messages through the sewers and across rooftops until he was killed in September 1944. The German Air Force conducted systematic bombing raids on Warsaw throughout the uprising. Stuka dive bombers flew mission after mission over the city. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The bombing was not just military, it was designed to terrorize and destroy. Warsaw's magnificent old town, one of the most beautiful in Europe, was being deliberately annihilated. Hitler had ordered the city's destruction, and the destruction was total. The sewers of Warsaw became the most important military infrastructure of the uprising. Fighters moved between different parts of the city underground, avoiding German forces above. The wounded were evacuated through the sewers, messages were carried, weapons were transported. The conditions were unimaginable: darkness, sewage, rats, the constant danger of German troops entering from above. Men, women, and children spent hours in the sewers, keeping the uprising alive. In late September, after weeks of pressure from Churchill and Roosevelt, Stalin finally allowed Allied aircraft to land on Soviet airfields after supply missions to Warsaw. But by then, it was almost too late. The Home Army was exhausted. Ammunition was almost gone. The Germans controlled most of the city. The fighters who had held Warsaw for nearly 2 months were running out of everything, including hope. On October 2, 1944, after 63 days of fighting, General Borka-Murowski signed the surrender agreement with the Germans. The agreement guaranteed the rights of the Home Army fighters as prisoners of war under the Geneva Convention, a remarkable achievement given what had happened during the uprising. As the fighters laid down their weapons and marched into captivity, the people of Warsaw lined the streets and applauded them. It was the most heartbreaking ovation in history. After the surrender, the Germans expelled the entire remaining population of Warsaw, approximately 500,000 people. They were marched out of the city with whatever they could carry: the elderly, the sick, children, everyone. They were sent to transit camps and then dispersed across occupied Poland and Germany. Warsaw, a city of over 1 million people, before the war was empty. And then the Germans began their final act. With the population gone, the Germans began the systematic destruction of Warsaw that Hitler had ordered. Special demolition units moved through the empty city with flamethrowers and explosives, building by building, street by street. The National Museum, the Royal Castle, the libraries, the hospitals, the churches. Everything that made Warsaw Warsaw was deliberately destroyed. By the time the Soviets finally entered the city in January 1945, 85% of Warsaw had been reduced to rubble. On January 17, 1945, 3.5 months after the uprising ended, Soviet forces finally entered Warsaw. They found a ghost city, 85% destroyed, empty streets, Rubble where buildings had stood. Warsaw that had existed for 7 centuries was gone. The Soviet-backed Polish provisional government moved into the ruins. The London Polish government, whose fighters had died for this city, was excluded. Poland had been liberated from one occupier and handed to another. The human cost of the Warsaw Uprising was staggering. 200,000 Polish civilians killed, the majority murdered by the Germans in atrocities rather than in combat. 16,000 Home Army fighters killed, 6,000 badly wounded, 15,000 taken prisoner. On the German side, approximately 17,000 killed and 9,000 wounded. Warsaw, a city of 1.3 million before the war, had lost nearly all of its population. It was one of the greatest human catastrophes of the entire Second World War. The role of Stalin in the Warsaw Uprising remains one of the most debated questions of the Second World War. Did he deliberately halt the Soviet advance to allow the Germans to destroy the Polish resistance? The evidence strongly suggests yes. Stalin referred to the Home Army fighters as criminals and adventurers. He refused to allow Allied aircraft to use Soviet airfields for supply missions for weeks. His deliberate inaction condemned 200,000 people to death and handed Poland to communist control. In Poland, the Warsaw Uprising became the defining moment of modern national identity. For decades under communist rule, it was suppressed. The Home Army was vilified by the Soviet-backed government. After communism fell in 1989, the uprising was fully recognized. The Warsaw Uprising Museum, opened in 2004 on the 60th anniversary, is the most visited museum in Poland. Every year on August 1st at exactly 5 p.m., the sirens sound across Warsaw. The whole city stops. For 1 minute, Poland remembers. In Warsaw today, there is a small bronze statue, a child soldier wearing an oversized helmet and carrying a submachine gun. It is called the Little Insurgent Mały Powstanek, commemorates the children who fought in the Warsaw Uprising. Boys and girls who should have been in school carrying messages, ammunition, fighting, dying for their city. People stop at this statue every day. They leave flowers, they leave toys, they never forget. After the war, the Polish people made a decision that the world had never seen before. They would rebuild Warsaw exactly as it had been. Using old paintings, photographs, architectural drawings, they reconstructed the old town of Warsaw brick by brick to look exactly as it did before the German destruction. In 1980, the reconstructed old town of Warsaw was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the only reconstruction in the world to receive this designation. Warsaw refused to stay dead. Churchill was deeply affected by the Warsaw Uprising, called it a tragedy of enormous magnitude. It pushed hard for Allied support, for supply drops, for Soviet cooperation. He had been largely powerless. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, just months after Warsaw fell, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin divided the post-war world. Poland was handed to the Soviet sphere of influence. Churchill wept. He knew what it meant for the people of Warsaw who had died for their freedom. The question of whether the people of Warsaw were betrayed by the Western Allies haunts the history of the uprising. Churchill wanted to help, but was overruled by the need for Soviet cooperation. Roosevelt was too focused on the Pacific War. Stalin was deliberately allowing the Germans to destroy his future political opponents. The people of Warsaw rose up, expecting Allied support. They received too little too late. 200,000 people paid for that political calculation with their lives. The survivors of the Warsaw Uprising scattered across Poland, and the world never forgot what had happened to their city. Under communism, they could not speak openly about the uprising. In private, they kept the memory alive. They passed the stories to their children and grandchildren. When communism fell in 1989, the floodgates opened. The testimonies came pouring out. The full truth of what had happened to Warsaw and what the Soviets had allowed to happen could finally be told. The Warsaw Uprising, 63 days, 200,000 civilians killed, an entire city destroyed, a Soviet army that watched and waited, and a city that refused to stay dead, rebuilding itself brick by brick until it stood again exactly as it had before. Every year on August 1st, at exactly 5 p.m., the sirens sound across Warsaw. The city stops. Poland remembers. Thank you for watching. Like and subscribe for more. Share your thoughts below.